Good morning, everybody. We are going to talk about functions today and what a function is. So, the definition of a function is that it is a relationship that assigns exactly one output for each input. So, in other words, if you plug a number into a function, there's only one number that come out of it, and we'll see some examples of those here in a minute. Okay? So, but it's important to note that for a function, there's only one possible output for each input. Now, we're not going to do this yet, but we are going to be graphing these. So we want to start thinking of the input values as our x's and the output values as our y's. Okay, because as you recall, when we plot points, when we put points on a graph, we need an x coordinate and a y coordinate. The x will be our input, the y will be our output. Okay, and what you want to think of is just plugging a number into a machine and seeing what pops out. For the term function rule, the function rule means what you do to the input to get the output. So it's the operation or operations that you perform on the input. So for instance, if your function rule is plus 10, what that means is anytime you plug in a number, you would add 10 to it, and that would give you your output. So if you input a 2, you would add 10 and you'd get out a 12. If you put in a 25, you'd add 10 and get out a 35. Okay. So the function rule is just what you do to the input to get the output. A function table, this is what you're going to be creating in your homework. A function table is a way to organize the inputs, the outputs, and kind of what you're doing to get from one to the other. So the rule will be in there as well. And we'll see what those look like on the next couple of slides. Now, domain and range. Domain and range, this might be your first time seeing these words, but it will not be your last. A domain and range become very important ideas in math, and people mix them up all the time. Okay, so we're going to try to learn which is which at this point and try to keep that straight in our minds. So the domain, I wrote x. Remember, x is the variable that we're using for our inputs. So the domain of a function is a set of all the inputs. So if you just take all the numbers that you plug in to the function and just write them as a group, that's your domain. Okay, now there's a specific way to write this. Usually we use these curly brackets and then just list the numbers separated by a comma. This is common mathematical notation for how you write a domain or a range. Okay. The range is a set of all the output values. Okay, so if the domain is numbers you plug into the function, the range is the numbers that you get out. So after you've applied this function rule, whether it's plus 10 or something else, the numbers that you end up with after doing that, that's your range. And you would write that here the same way. Okay? So make sure you have all of these vocab pieces down before you move on to the examples. All right, first example. So our function rule here is x minus 2. And all that means is that we're going to take our input and subtract 2. Okay, so your function tables, when you make them, should have 3 columns. The first column is going to be your inputs, and you're usually going to be given what those are. Then you're going to apply your rule. That'll happen in the middle column, where you're just replacing x with whatever your input is. And then here's going to be where your outputs are. Okay, so my function rule is to take the input and subtract 2, and that'll give me the output. So if I plugged in a 4, 4 minus 2 is 2, there's my output. If I plug in a 5, 5 minus 2 is 3, so 3 is my output. If I plug in a 6, 6 minus 2 is 4, so 4 is my output. If I plug in a 7, 7 minus 2 is 5, that's my output. Notice for each one of these, I just replaced the x with whatever the input number was. So it's kind of like what we did with evaluating expressions. We're just doing it for 4 times, once for each of these numbers. All right, now if we go back to our definition of domain, remember the domain was a set of all the input values, the numbers that we plugged in. So those are the numbers right here in the x column. Okay, so if I'm listing my domain, I just use my curly brackets and just list those numbers. 4, 5, 6, and 7 is the domain of this function. Okay, for the range, remember that's all the outputs. So I go over here to the output column and list those numbers are the range. So 2, 3, 4, and 5, that's the range of this function. Okay, now for the equation, we start off just talking about the function rule, because that's kind of a good way to think about what's happening to get from the input to the output. But you're usually going to want to write this as an equation that tells you how x and y are related. So in order for it to do that, remember, if it tells you how x and y are related, it has to have x and y in it. Also, to be an equation, it has to have an equal sign. Okay. So here we just wrote x minus 2. Well, when we did x minus 2, what that equals is our output, right? And we're using y to stand for our output. So to write this as an equation, we just have to basically take our function rule and put a y equals in front of it. Okay, so y equals x minus 2. So what's that saying is your output equals your input minus 2. Okay, so when you subtract 2 from your input, you get your output. Okay, but to be an equation, it has to have a y and an x, and it has to have an equal sign. Okay. All right, and this is ultimately what we're going to be graphing and what our function is going to be. All right, so let's do another one. So here the function rule is x plus 5. Okay, so if I'm going to plug in these numbers, first I'll plug in a 3. 3 plus 5 is going to give me 8. Okay, next one I'm going to plug in a 6. So 6 plus 5 gives me 11. Then I'll plug in a 9. 9 plus 5 gives me 14. Lastly, plugging in a 12. 12 plus 5 equals 17. Again, just replacing the x with whatever my input is. And in each case, I'm just adding 5 to that input to get my output. Okay, if I list the domain and range, again, the domain is the list of my inputs. Okay. So I'll use my curly brackets again and list those numbers: 3, 6, 9, and 12. Okay, the range is my outputs. So that's 8, 11, 14, and 17. Okay. For the equation, if the function rule is x plus 5, to make that an equation, I just need to add a y equals. Okay, say the y, the output equals the input plus 5. Y equals x plus 5. And that tells me how x and y are related, right? Y is just 5 more than x because I added 5 to it. All right, next example, let's do 3 times. So 3x, remember, whenever you have a number and a letter next to each other, it means you're multiplying. So 3x means 3 times x. So that's what we're doing here. So again, I'm just going to replace the x with each of my inputs one at a time. So 3 times 0 gives me 0. So if your input is 0, your output is 0. If I plug in a 2, 3 times 2 is 6. If I plug in a 4, 3 times 4 is 12. If I plug in a 6, 3 times 6 is 18. Okay, so this is my completed function table. I can write the domain and range. Again, the domain would just be the set of these numbers. Which would be, in curly brackets, 0, 2, 4, and 6. And the range would be the set of the outputs over here, which is 0, 6, 12, and 18. Okay. The equation, if the rule is 3x, the equation, I just would write y is equal to, my output is equal to 3x, 3 times the input. All right, one last example. See if we can handle one that has more than one step. I think we can. All right, so here the function rule is 7x plus 4. So that means when I plug in a number, I'm going to multiply it by 7 first and then add 4. Well, why multiply first? Well, hopefully you remember, because of order of operations, you would have to do this multiplying before adding, and this 7x means 7 times x. Okay, so one at a time, I'm going to replace the x with my input, do the operations, and see what my output is. So if I plug in a 0, 7 times 0 is 0, plus 4 is 4. If I plug in a 1, 7 times 1 is 7, plus 4 is 11. If I plug in a 2, 7 times 2 is 14, plus 4 is 18. If I plug in a 3, 7 times 3 is 21, plus 4 is 25. Okay. So this one, we already have the equation listed. Notice that we've got a y equals here at the top. So y equals 7x plus 4. This is the equation. So the domain is just my x values, my inputs, which is 0, 1, 2, 3. And the range is just my output values, or my y's, which is 4, 11, 18, 25. Okay. Next time we pick this up, we're going to be looking at graphing these. And again, we've talked about graphing the x and y coordinates. So think about these being our x values and these being the y values that are connected to them. So that'll tell us the points that we're going to plot when we actually graph these functions. All right, until next time.